I'm standing alone on a beach, listening to the Pacific. As each wave rolls in, booming, roaring, growling, hissing, I listen to its voice, the unique contours of its rising and falling, its singular crescendo and diminuendo. I listen for the interval between this wave and the wave before it and the one that comes after. I listen as the waves advance and retreat, melding and passing through one another, crashing like cymbals on the shore. I listen to the small stones clattering over one another, pulled inexorably back into the unimaginable vastness of water that stretches away toward Asia. I do my best to listen as intently, as deeply as I can. Even so, my mind wanders. A plastic bottle among the rocks reminds me that there are vast islands of garbage drifting far out at sea. A strong gust of wind reminds me of the increasingly capricious weather and of the storms that lash this and other shores with growing ferocity. The burning sunlight reminds me of melting tundra and expanding deserts, of diminishing polar ice and rising seas all over the earth. I do my best to refocus my attention, to return only to listening. Yet how can I stand here today and not think of these things? The earth is 4,540,000,000 years old. The entire history of the human species has unfolded in the 11,700 years since the most recent ice age, a brief period of geologic time, an eye blink really, known as the Holocene. Throughout our history, we humans have altered the surface of the earth. But over the past century or so, we've become an undeniable geologic force, making deep, troubling changes to the earth and its living systems. Today, a growing number of geologists believe we have left the Holocene and entered a new geologic period, the Anthropocene, in which the dominant geologic force is humanity itself. What does this mean for music? What does it mean for my work as a composer, or for any artist working in any medium today? These looming threats to the biosphere compel me to write music that's more than mere entertainment, more than a personal narrative, or a celebration of the heroic struggle of the individual. But can music be engaged with current events and at the same time detached from them? Can music resonate with the world around us and yet still create a world of its own? When I was younger, I was a full-time environmental activist. In the 1970s and 80s, I worked for the Wilderness Society, the Alaska Coalition, and the Northern Alaska Environmental Center. The small role that I played in the passage of the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, the single largest land preservation law in history, and in helping prevent destructive dams, highways, mining, and oil drilling in Alaska remain among the most satisfying experiences of my life. But the time came when I realized that I had to choose between my life as an activist and life as an artist. In that moment, I decided that someone else could take my place in politics, and no one else could make the music that I imagined but me. So I took a leap of faith in the belief that music and art can matter every bit as much as activism and politics. And over the years, as climate change and other global environmental threats have accelerated, and as our political systems have become increasingly dysfunctional, I've come to believe that fundamentally, art matters more than politics. As a composer, it's my belief that music has the power to inspire a renewal of human consciousness, culture, and yes, even politics. And yet, I refuse to make political art. To my way of thinking, more often than not, political art fails as politics and as art. I believe that to reach its fullest power, to be most moving and most fully useful to us, art must be itself. If my work doesn't function powerfully as music, then all the poetic program notes and extra musical justifications in the world mean nothing. When I'm true to the music, when I let the music be whatever it wants to be, then everything else, including any social or political meaning, will follow. From the titles of my works, Songbird Songs, In the White Silence, Become Ocean, it's clear that I draw inspiration from the world around me. But when I enter my studio, I do so with the hope of leaving the world behind, at least for a while. Of course, it's impossible to sustain that state of grace for very long. Inevitably, thoughts intrude. Sometimes I think about people, places, and experiences in my life. Sometimes I think about the larger state of the world and the uncertain future of humanity. Even so, I'm not interested in sending messages or telling stories with music. And although I used to paint musical landscapes, that no longer interests me either. The truth is, I'm no longer interested in making music about anything. Though a piece of music may begin with a particular thought or image, as the music emerges, it becomes a world of its own, independent of my extra musical associations. In the end, those initial inspirations may remain as a title or a program note, invitations to the listener to find their own way into the music. However, the last thing that I want to do is to limit the listener's imagination. So if a listener feels constrained by any words that I may offer along with the music, then I encourage her to ignore them. And few things make me happier than when a listener hears something, experiences something, discovers something in the music that the composer didn't know was there. It's only through the presence, awareness, and creative engagement of the listener that the music is complete. For much of my life, I've made music inspired by the outdoors, but it was almost always heard indoors. Several years ago, I heard my percussion work, Strange and Sacred Noise, performed in the Anza Desert of California, and then in the autumn woods in New England, and finally on the tundra of the Alaska Range. These experiences were both humbling and provocative. In the concert hall, Strange and Sacred Noise sounds big, powerful, overwhelming, even frightening. But outside, a lot of it just blew away in the wind. So after 40 years making music inspired by the outdoors, but usually heard indoors, it finally occurred to me that it might be time to step outside, to compose music intended from the start to be performed, heard, experienced outdoors. The result was Inuksuit for 9 to 99 percussionists, which was first performed here at the Banff Center on the summer solstice 2009. Making music outdoors invites a different mode of awareness. You might call it ecological listening. In the concert hall, we seal ourselves off from the outside world. We concentrate our listening on a handful of carefully produced sounds. Outdoors, rather than focusing our attention inward, we're challenged to expand our awareness, to encompass a multiplicity of sounds, to hear as far as we can hear, to listen outward. We're invited to receive messages not only from the composer and the performing musicians, but also from the larger world around us. In Inuksuit, the musicians are dispersed widely throughout a large open area. Listeners, too, may move around freely and discover their own individual listening points. And it's my hope that Inuksuit may help expand our awareness of the never-ending music of the world and perhaps transform seemingly inert space into more fully, more deeply experienced place. Inuksuit is inspired by the stone sentinels constructed over the centuries by the Inuit in the windswept expanses of the Arctic. Those landscapes that Canadians sometimes call the Big Lonely. As I composed Inuksuit, I imagined each musician and each listener as a solitary figure in a vast open landscape. I thought it was a piece about solitude. What I wasn't prepared for, what came as a delightful surprise to me, was the strong sense of community that this piece seems to create. Since its premiere here at Banff, Inuksuit has been performed frequently all over the world. The piece has taken on an extraordinary life of its own, quite independent of the composer. And there seems to be something inherent in the music itself that encourages community. Mounting a successful performance of Inuksuit requires an unusual degree of cooperation among the musicians, and the active participation of the listener seems to heighten the sense of a shared experience. Those stone Inuksuit in the Arctic serve a variety of functions. Some Inuksuit indicate the best route from one place to another. Some mark an especially good place for fishing or hunting caribou. Some Inuksuit are so old that their meanings have been lost in time. But they are all markers of the passing of humans in a vast landscape. The Inuktitut word for the word Inuksuit translates more or less literally to act in the capacity of the human. After Inuksuit came another large-scale outdoor work, Sila, The Breath of the World. And in these outdoor pieces, the musicians are dispersed widely throughout a large open space. There's no conductor. Every musician is a soloist. No two musicians play exactly the same part. And each musician follows his or her own unique path through both the physical and the musical landscape of the piece. The same is true for the listener. There's no best seat in the house for Inuksuit or Sila. You may choose to root yourself in one specific location and let the music move all around you, or you may choose to wander freely throughout the performance following your own ears, actively shaping your own experience, creating your own mix of the music. And for me, this relationship between the music and the listener simulates a human society in which we all feel more deeply engaged with the world and more empowered to help change it. Making music outdoors has also led me to a new understanding of musical polyphony, not just as lines against lines or note against note, but polyphony in the sense that the Canadian poet Robert Bringhurst speaks of it as a community of voices, an ecosystem of sounds. In a performance outdoors, it's sometimes difficult to say exactly where the piece ends and where the world takes over. And rather than a single point of interest, every point around the aural horizon is a potential point of interest, a call to listen. With characteristically radical elegance, John Cage defined music as sounds heard. And the idea that music depends on sound and listening might seem as self-evident as the idea that we human animals are an inseparable part of nature. But both these simple truths challenge us to practice ecological awareness in our individual and our collective lives. Cage's definition of harmony was sounds heard together. Listening to the multiplicity of sounds around us all the time, we learn to hear the marvelous harmonies they create. And hearing those harmonies, we come to understand the place of our own human voices within them. An Inuit hunter scanning the tundra for game will tell you that you learn the most by watching the edges. For most of my creative life, I've lived far removed from the centers of cosmopolitan culture. In Alaska, I imagined that I could work on the outer edge of culture, drawing my music more directly from the earth. Over 4 decades, I listened for that music in the mountains and on the tundra, on the shoulders of glaciers, the shores of the Arctic Ocean, and in the northern forest, learning the songs of the birds. And now I stand here on this beach by the Pacific, still listening, still immersed in the music of the sea. At night, as my wife and I sleep, it flows into the deepest reaches of my consciousness. There are moments when it sounds as if the waves will come crashing through the open windows and carry us away. And then it falls to a whisper, and it startles me awake. In these sudden, still moments, I'm filled with an exquisite mixture of tranquility and dread. In the morning, I rise and do my best to write down the music that I heard in my dreams. As I listen day after day, night after night, a new sound begins to take shape. Vast and amorphous, deep and inexorable. My thoughts return often to the melting of the polar ice and the rising of the seas. I remember that all life on this earth first emerged from the sea, and I wonder if we humans as a species may once again return to the sea sooner than we imagine. Yet if you ask me if I'm composing a piece about climate change, I'll tell you, no, not really. Then is this music about the sea? Yes, well, in a way. But what I really hope is that this music is an ocean of its own, an inexorable sea of sound that just may carry the listener away into an oceanic state of mind. Geologists today are engaged in a lively debate about whether the Anthropocene qualifies as a legitimate geologic epoch. Regardless of the outcome of that debate, we can no longer deny the reality that human impacts on the Earth are unprecedented in our history. There are some who envision a good Anthropocene, in which we humans manage to save ourselves and minimize our impacts on the Earth through new technologies. But blind faith in technology is a central part of what got us into this predicament in the first place. And we simply cannot engineer our way out of it. Others contend that the very concept of the Anthropocene leads us to the inevitable conclusion that it's already too late for us to change anything. Maybe so. But I believe that even if it is too late to avert disaster, we have both an ethical and a biological imperative to try. The natural order of things is change. Sometimes change is rapid, sometimes it's dramatic, sometimes change is catastrophic. From an anthropocentric point of view, the changes we humans have set into motion are potentially catastrophic. Species come and species go. Sooner or later, so will we. But are we really so dead set on doing ourselves in? The most basic animal instinct is self-preservation. Might that existential instinct be enough to pull us back from the brink? Perhaps this is where biology and ethics converge. Aside from the deep ethical questions raised by our role as agents of extinction for so many other species, I believe we have an ethical obligation to act in our own enlightened self-interest. And, as we're coming to understand, at last, our own self-interest is inextricably tied to the diversity and health of the larger biosphere. Unless we humans discover our proper place and learn to live in balance with the larger community of life on this earth, our future looks doubtful. Our survival as a species depends on a fundamental change of our way of being in the world. This is what so many of us, in music and art, in science, in education, yes, even in politics, in every field of human endeavor, are working on today. My work is not activism, it is art. As an artist, my primary responsibility must be to my art as art. And yet, it's impossible for me to separate my life as a composer from my life as a thinking human being and a citizen of the earth. If my music can inspire people to listen more deeply to this miraculous world we inhabit, then I will have done what I can as a composer to help us navigate this perilous era of our own creation. For me, it all begins with listening.